Well, welcome to this slightly late running home retreat, which I've called A Cloud of Witnesses 6. Clearly, one of the reasons that I'm offering this series of home retreats is because I'm enthusiastic about the patristic writers and other spiritual writers, indeed, in the Church's long tradition. I may have mentioned in a previous home retreat that I used to be an Anglican before I was received into the Church as a graduate student. And with absolutely no intention at all of in any way maligning that Anglican tradition from which I came. It was, after all, where my Christianity was planted and began to grow. One of the great joys for me on becoming a Catholic was realizing that suddenly, at least for me, there were now 2,000 years of tradition to hunt around looking for nourishment. And it was no longer necessary to discount any of it. I say that because previously I'd had to pick and choose really between what we might think of as kosher writings and others which inconveniently mention things like the role of the saints and Our Lady or the real presence in the Eucharist, doctrines which at the time I didn't believe in. I thought then, and I guess I still think it, that it was extraordinary that we have all of these writings to choose from as we endeavour to journey onwards in our life of faith. And I think it's one of the joys of our faith, this enormous tradition with so many streams, each subtly different, but none less valid than the others. And of course they all lead to the same place, hopefully, to God himself. Well, one of the ways in which this joy lives on for me is occasionally discovering at slightly greater depth someone whom perhaps I'd previously skipped over or not given much attention. And the subject of this home retreat, St. Catherine of Siena, was one of those people for me. I knew she'd been an impressive woman and so on, and her reputation as a teacher of Christianity was illustrious. That's, I guess, why she was made a doctor of the Church by Pope St. Paul VI. But much more about her and her writings I didn't know. Well, this all changed slightly a year or two ago when we had our community retreat in the summer, as usual, and it was preached on that occasion by Father Paul Murray, the Irish Dominican. And St. Catherine featured pretty heavily in that retreat, and what he had to say about her, and perhaps more importantly, what he allowed her to say for herself, impressed me enough to give me the motivation to look her up. Thankfully, we had the book here in the library. I suppose this is one of the hopes, maybe the only hope, that I have for this series of home retreats, that at least one person might just hear a quotation from a writer that they find attractive and feel moved to follow up the reference and maybe to become quite an intimate friend and disciple of that writer that they've just discovered. I need though to begin this talk with a caveat. This subject is well and truly out of my comfort zone. I don't know that I'm an expert on much or anything, to be quite perfectly honest, but I'm certainly not an expert on St. Catherine of Siena or her writings. This then isn't going to be a sort of groundbreaking academic talk in any sense. God preserve us from such things, I guess. Rather, it'll be a few potted details of St. Catherine's biography, and then the sharing, or the pointing to rather, some passages of her writings that so far have enthused me. So Caterina di Jacopo di Benincasa, known to us as St. Catherine of Siena, was born on the Feast of the Annunciation, the 25th of March, 1347 in Siena, oddly enough. Probably the most famous biography of her is the life of Catherine, written by her confessor and friend, and later Master General of the Dominicans, Blessed Raymond of Capua. It's worth a read. In brief, though, Catherine was the daughter of a local cloth dyer, and her mother was the daughter of a local poet. From a very young age, she had what we might call pronounced mystical experiences in prayer, I guess. She had visions, and it wasn't long before she vowed to devote herself and her whole life to God entirely. She vigorously, to that end, resisted her parents' attempts to marry her off. And she eventually found her own place in the Mantellate, a local sort of association of devout women. I guess it means something like women who wear the veil. It was, it's true, a form of active life, based heavily on Dominican spirituality, and practicing the corporal works of mercy was key to that, looking after the sick and the poor and so on. But she was also a deep contemplative. She lived inside a sort of cell, her own quarters, if you like, inside the family home, in near total silence and solitude. And I think her family thought she was nuts, really, sometimes at least. She fasted very severely. And in the end, she's said to have survived on the Eucharist alone. And I think this is one of those things which reminds us that not every aspect of the lives of the saints is for our minute imitation without discernment. It's quite an extreme thing, that, isn't it? Total fasting and only living on the Eucharist. And we need to think very carefully and have some prudent advice, I think, from the spiritual director before we decide that such things are what God is like. Still, the mystical life carried on, but so did the works of charity. And I guess the combination of these two meant that she developed a real a reputation for holiness. Or rather, that reputation for holiness grew up around her, maybe despite her. I doubt very much that she was cultivating it. She became well known in public and ecclesiastical circles in Italy and in Europe, more widely in her own time. She was a vigorous advocate, and she's very vigorous in general, but she was a vigorous advocate for church reform, and she may or may not have been instrumental in getting Gregory XI to return to Rome, take the Pope back to Rome from Avignon. She died in Rome then in 1380, aged only 33. 33. In terms of her spiritual and theological writings, she authored a major treatise called The Dialogue of Divine Providence. But perhaps in terms of volume, just in terms of extent, the most significant elements of her output are actually the many letters that she wrote or dictated through scribes that used to assist her during the course of her life. And some 382 of these have survived, and hence, were we desirous, could be read by us. Being honest, during that retreat that we had those years ago from Father Paul Murray, it was the quotes that Father Paul gave us from her letters that really caught my imagination in terms of her thought. Why? Who knows at one level? One possible answer is because they're really vehicles, these letters, of St. Catherine's experience. Monks tend to like it, at least that's my view, when people share their experience of the spiritual life with us. I sometimes scandalize people, I think, and probably you now, by saying that I'm not really desperately interested in theology as a study, as a discipline. It's not that I don't think it's important, it's just that it doesn't particularly set me on fire. Sort of theological speculation. I guess it's because I draw a distinction in my own mind between, on the one hand, knowing God, and on the other, knowing about him. It's not that I don't particularly want to know about him. After all, can you really know somebody without knowing something about them? But I suppose looked at from the other aspect, it is possible to know quite a lot about somebody without really knowing them at all. And given the choice, it's the knowing them that I want in life and in the spiritual life, I think, with my neighbour and with God. To the extent that it's necessary then to know about God in order to know him, I do want to know about him, obviously. But what I really want is precisely to know him. And that means that I'm always slightly electrified by meeting people, whether in the flesh or through their writings or their preaching or whatever, who clearly do know God. It's obvious to me that they do know God. And by learning from them how to set about the business of getting to know him better myself. In other words, I'm electrified, I guess, by learning from their experience. I suppose it's obvious that some genres of writings will be more likely to communicate this sort of experience that we, or at least I, am looking for. Sermons are a classic one, such as those of Bernard, Aylward and Garrick that I've spoken of in previous retreats. Monastic conferences would be another, such as those of Dorotheus of Gaza that we also spoke about. The sayings of the Desert Father, also covered, are another example. And of course letters, such as those of St. Catherine, are another possibility again. I suppose another very human factor that might push me, and maybe you, in the direction of these genres, is their relative brevity. We don't have to commit to digesting a sort of War and Peace length tome with these sorts of writings. They're relatively short and usually sweet, and we can spend time then, having read them, digesting and thinking about what it is that we've read and what it might mean for us. I guess there's a caveat here too, isn't there, with any of these spiritual writings and writers. We do need to remember that the sermons, letters, sayings or whatever were addressed to a particular person or set of people at a particular time and place, and possibly they were in a particular state of life. And they may not all be necessarily 100% applicable to just anybody. In other words, when we seek to apply them to ourselves, we need as ever to have a bit of discernment. Again, perhaps most appropriately through some sort of prudent spiritual friend or advisor, and ask them before we rush to apply something to ourselves which might not in fact be relevant to us. But we will sometimes find in these texts things that are obviously elements of a universal spiritual truth, as well as particular truths that just happen to resonate with us where we are. And again, it's lovely when it happens, that, isn't it? But it's not something I find that we can just turn on at will. I've always, I guess, found it interesting how much providence there is in reading, spiritual reading. We can try to read something, whether it's the scriptures, whether it's writings of a spiritual author, whatever, at one time, and we think, if we're not feeling particularly measured, that it's absolute rubbish and it's got nothing to say to us. And yet we come back to the same thing, precisely the same text at a later date, and we read it, and suddenly it's the best thing since sliced bread and just what we needed. I think these letters of St. Catherine, for me at least, fit fairly and squarely into the category of some of the richest experiential teaching about the life of the Spirit that I've come across. She's very direct, she's very human, and she communicates very readily. I said she's very human. What do I mean by that? I guess, like so many of the writers that we've been considering, she has a very perceptive understanding of human nature, and maybe religious with a small r, human nature in particular. And she also, though, has a desire for God, which I think communicates itself and is quite infectious. For once, I'm actually not going to go through now here my own purple passages from those letters that I've put aside for you in the link below the video. You may have to click on more ... and get a link to a file that you can download. But do have a read of them yourself if you feel moved to, and see whether they appeal to you. I've also put there a link to an online, slightly antiquated translation, but at least it's free, collection of some of the letters of St. Catherine, not every single last word, but some of those letters, just in case you wanted to explore a bit further and see whether there's anything else in these letters that might appeal to you. And I've also put there a link to Father Paul Murray, the Irish Dominican's book on the teaching of St. Catherine, which I think is very well worth a read, very approachable and very interesting. So, in other words, I wish you a blessed time of reflection with St. Catherine of Siena, Virgin, mystic and doctor of the Church. God bless.